A man posts a job online that sounds too good to be true. When three men show up looking for work, they disappear without a trace. What police later uncover reveals a plan far more sinister than anyone expected. In late 2011, a quiet but deeply unsettling pattern began forming across rural Ohio. At first, no one saw it for what it really was. Men were going missing, not all from the same town, not all with the same background. Some had families who quickly reported them missing, while others, more isolated, disappeared without immediate attention. On the surface, these cases seemed unrelated. Investigators would later realize there was a connection hiding in plain sight. Each of these men had been searching for something: steady work, stability, a fresh start. Many were going through difficult times financially. Some were trying to rebuild their lives, and others were simply looking for a quieter lifestyle away from everything. Somehow, each of them came across the same type of opportunity: an online job listing. It promised simple work, caretaking land, watching over property, sometimes even living on site. It sounded peaceful, reliable, like a second chance. But that opportunity came with a meeting, and that meeting led them somewhere remote, deep into wooded areas, far from towns, far from help. One by one, they walked into those woods, and they never came back out. At the center of this case was Richard Beasley. Beasley wasn't new to crime. By the time these events unfolded, he had already spent years building a record that included theft, fraud, and violent offenses. He understood how the system worked, and more importantly, how people worked. What made him especially dangerous was his ability to blend in. He didn't appear threatening. He could speak calmly, confidently, and in a way that made people feel at ease. He knew how to present himself as someone trustworthy, someone offering help, not harm. Beneath that surface was someone who carefully observed and exploited vulnerability. By 2011, Beasley had found a new way to do exactly that: through the internet. Platforms like Craigslist allowed him to reach strangers directly, people who were actively searching for opportunities and were more likely to trust someone offering them. He wasn't just committing crimes, he was building a system. The Craigslist ads were carefully crafted to feel real. They didn't promise anything unrealistic. In fact, that's what made them so effective. The jobs were described as simple caretaker roles: watching over rural land, maintaining property, and sometimes handling minor farm duties. The listings often included decent, believable pay, flexible or long-term arrangements, and the possibility of housing. For someone struggling or trying to start over, it sounded like the perfect situation. And that's exactly who Beasley targeted: men who needed something to work out, men who were willing to travel, and men who trusted that an opportunity like this could be real. Once someone would respond, Beasley would communicate with them directly. He would answer questions, give directions, and arrange a meeting. The meeting place was never random. It was always isolated. He would guide them to rural areas, often in southeastern Ohio, where dense woods surrounded the location. These were places where there were no witnesses, no cell service, and help was far away. Everything about the setup gave Beasley control, and by the time the victim arrived, they were already in a vulnerable position: alone, disoriented, and completely dependent on the person they had come to meet. Beasley didn't act alone. With him was Brogan Rafferty, just 16 years old at the time. Rafferty's involvement adds another layer to the case, one that raises questions about influence and manipulation. According to reports in court proceedings, Beasley took on a dominant mentor-like role in Rafferty's life. He guided him, controlled him, pulled him into a situation gradually. At first, the crimes may have centered around robbery, luring victims in and stealing from them. But over time, the plan escalated, and Rafferty followed. Whether out of fear, influence, or desire to prove himself, he became part of the operation, helping with logistics, being present during the crimes, and participating in a pattern that became increasingly violent. Together, they developed a routine, and once it worked, they kept repeating it. The victims in this case weren't random. They were specifically chosen based on vulnerability. One of them was David Pauly. Pauly had been actively searching for work. When he came across the listing, it seemed like a genuine opportunity. He traveled to meet Beasley, likely expecting to discuss the job and possibly begin a new chapter in his life. Instead, he was led into a wooded area. There, he was robbed and then killed. Another victim, Timothy Kern, followed a similar path. He responded to the ad, made the trip, and trusted that he was walking into a legitimate situation. He never returned. There were multiple victims connected to this scheme, each one following the same pattern. Initial contact through Craigslist, a planned meeting in a remote location, isolation, robbery, and ultimately, murder. These were not crimes of impulse. They were deliberate, repeated actions carried out with the control and consistency. For a time, it seemed like these crimes might go undetected. There were no immediate witnesses, the locations were remote, and the victims had little connection to each other beyond the job listing. But everything changed because of one person, Scott Davis. Davis responded to the ad just like the others. He communicated with Beasley, arranged a meeting, and followed the directions into the woods. At some point during that meeting, the situation turned violent. Beasley shot him. But unlike the others, Davis survived. Despite his injuries, he managed to escape the scene and seek help. His survival was nothing short of extraordinary, and it gave investigators something they hadn't had before, a first-hand account. He was able to describe what happened, where it happened, and who was responsible. That single event, the one moment that didn't go according to Beasley's plan, exposed everything. With Davis's testimony, law enforcement finally had a clear direction. Search teams were sent into the areas described, remote wooded locations that had previously seemed insignificant. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Hidden within those woods were shallow graves, personal belongings left behind by victims, and evidence tying the crimes back to the Craigslist scheme. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle, turning what had once been separate missing persons cases into a connected series of murders. The scale of what had happened became clear. This wasn't a single crime. It was a pattern. Authorities quickly moved to arrest both Richard Beasley and Brogan Rafferty. During the trial, the full details of the case came to light, and how the ads were created, how the victims were selected, and how the crimes were carried out. Beasley was identified as the leader, the one who planned everything and carried out the most violent actions. Witness testimony and evidence showed a clear pattern of manipulation and control. He showed little remorse. Rafferty's defense focused heavily on his age and the influence Beasley had over him. While he was still held accountable, the court recognized the dynamic between the two. In 2013, Richard Beasley was convicted of multiple counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. Brogan Rafferty, due to being a minor at the time, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal process brought some closure, but it couldn't undo what had been done. What makes this case especially disturbing is how calculated it was. Beasley didn't rely on chance. He created a system that gave him complete control at every stage. He chose vulnerable victims. He built trust before meeting them. He controlled the location, and he eliminated witnesses. Everything was intentional, and that level of planning is what made it so effective and so dangerous. After the case became public, it changed how many people viewed online marketplaces like Craigslist. What once felt like a convenient way to find jobs or opportunities now carried a sense of risk. The case became a warning about trusting strangers online, meeting in isolated locations, and verifying opportunities before committing. It showed how easily something ordinary could be turned into something dangerous. The story of the Craigslist killer isn't just about violence. It's about manipulation. It's about how trust can be built, exploited, and used against someone. Because none of the victims expected what would happen. They weren't taking extreme risks. They were answering a job ad, looking for something better. And sometimes, that's exactly what makes someone vulnerable. Because by the time the truth reveals itself, you're already too far from safety to turn back. In March of 2023, a case out of St. Petersburg began with confusion, but quickly turned into something far more disturbing. It started with a welfare check. Inside a quiet apartment, police discovered the body of a young mother. The scene showed clear signs of violence. This wasn't natural, and it wasn't accidental. Almost immediately, something else made the situation far more urgent. The woman's 2-year-old son was gone. No one knew where he was. No one knew if he was safe. And at that moment, the case shifted from a homicide investigation into a desperate search for a missing child. That child was Taylin Mosley. In the hours that followed, investigators would begin piecing together a timeline, one that would reveal a sequence of events so tragic, so unsettling, that it quickly captured national attention. The victim inside the apartment was Pashun Jeffrey, just 20 years old. She was a young mother raising her toddler, and by all accounts, her life centered around her son. Taylin was only 2 years old, still at an age where he depended entirely on the people around him for care, protection, and love. Friends and family described Pashun as caring and devoted. Like many young parents, she was navigating life while raising a child, trying to build stability and a future. There were no signs from the outside that anything this violent was about to happen. But inside the apartment, something had escalated beyond control. Pashun had suffered multiple stab wounds. The nature of the injuries indicated a violent personal attack, something intense, not random. And while that alone was devastating, the absence of Talon made it even worse, because now there were two victims, one confirmed and one missing. As investigators began their work, one of the first priorities was establishing a timeline, figuring out who had last seen Pashun and Talon, and what had happened in the hours leading up to the discovery. That's when attention quickly turned to Thomas Mosley. He was Talon's father and had been in contact with Pashun. In cases like this, investigators always look closely at people who were recently around the victim, and Mosley became a key focus almost immediately. Not long after, he was located at a hospital. That alone wasn't unusual until the details came out. He had injuries to his hands, including cuts. Injuries like that can sometimes be associated with violent encounters, especially those involving knives. At that point, it didn't confirm anything, but it raised serious questions. And as detectives continued building the timeline, those questions only became more important. While investigators worked the homicide scene, another effort was happening at the same time, a search for Talon. Because in those early hours, there was still hope. Hope that he had been taken. Hope that he was somewhere nearby. And hope that he could be found alive. Law enforcement began searching surrounding areas, checking locations, speaking to neighbors, and trying to track any movement connected to the case. Community members also became aware of the situation. Cases involving children tend to spread quickly, and people began paying attention, hoping for updates, hoping for good news. But as time passed, the urgency turned into concern, and that concern slowly began turning into fear. A few days into the investigation, attention shifted towards a body of water near Lake Maggiore in St. Petersburg. Search efforts led authorities there based on developing evidence and the timeline they had built. What they found was devastating. Inside the water, they discovered Talon Mosley. For everyone involved, investigators, family, the community, it was the moment hope disappeared. The child they had been searching for was no longer missing. He had been killed. The circumstances surrounding how he was found made it clear that this was intentional. This wasn't an accident or a case of a child wandering off. This was part of the same act of violence that had taken his mother's life. At that point, the case officially became a double homicide. With both victims now accounted for, investigators focused entirely on building a case. Every piece of evidence began pointing in one direction: Thomas Mosley. His connection to both victims, the timeline of events, his injuries, and the lack of any other credible suspect. All of it began forming a clear picture. According to investigators, the sequence of events likely began inside the apartment where Pashun was attacked. After that, Talon was taken from the scene. At some point afterward, he was killed and placed in the water. While exact details of every moment may never be fully known publicly, the overall conclusion became clear to authorities. This was not random. It was deliberate. Thomas Mosley was arrested and formally charged in connection with the deaths. He faced serious charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. As the case moved forward, It drew widespread attention, not just locally, but nationally. The details were difficult for many people to process, especially given the age of the child involved, a 2-year-old. Cases like this often leave people searching for answers that don't come easily. What makes this case especially heavy isn't just what happened, it's trying to understand how something like this could happen. There's no simple explanation. Investigators can establish facts like who, when, or where, but the why is often more complicated. It can involve personal conflict, emotional escalation, or factors that aren't always visible from the outside. And in cases involving children, those questions feel even more important because there's an added layer of innocence, an understanding that the child had no control over what was happening. The deaths of Pashun Jeffrey and Taylin Mosley had a deep impact on the community in St. Petersburg. Vigils were held, people gathered to remember them, strangers followed the case, feeling the weight of what had happened. It became more than just a news story. It became something people felt, a reminder of how quickly life can change, and how some of the most tragic situations happen in places that seem completely ordinary from the outside. The story of Taylin Mosley is one that stays with people, not just because of the crime, but because of what was lost. A young mother with her life ahead of her, a child who had never had the chance to grow up, and a series of events that turned something ordinary into something unthinkable. Because sometimes, the most unsettling part isn't just the outcome, it's how quickly everything changed. From a normal day to something that can never be undone.